I am very thrilled to open up 2015 Founders Day with this event. I just think it's the neatest thing in the world. This cemetery, of course, means a lot to me, having my wife and my daughter buried. We're down over the hill. But as I walk this cemetery, and I'm out here a lot, I just think it's a beautiful setting. We are here to honor our past forefathers and our past foremothers. They are out there. The Call families are spread out here. The people you'll meet tonight are spread out. And we're here to honor them. So don't feel uncomfortable. I know some people are uncomfortable when they walk through a cemetery. You needn't feel that way because we truly are here to honor them. All right? I'm very happy that the Algona branch of the AAU participate in making this program possible. The Kossuth County Genealogy Society make this program possible with funding from the Haggard Too Good Trust and from our Founders Day Committee. We can get people into costumes and feed free lemonade and free cookies after we're all done. And you got to stay. I ordered 200 cookies. All right? Now, look at my waistline. You don't want me taking more cookies home. So you got to stay and help me eat those cookies tonight. Okay? Founders Day kicks off tonight. We're all day tomorrow. So if you don't have a brochure, pick up a brochure downtown anywhere. Go into our Welcome Center would be the easiest. In fact, check into the Welcome Center and see the photos that I had put up today on the far west wall. Check those out. Those are just brand new today. Give me your opinion and what you think of them. And then you can get a brochure to know what's going on the rest of Founders Day. Okay, so it's a real pleasure this time. Jane Nettleton is representing the AAU Algona branch, AAUW branch, and at this time, she has a few comments to make.
Yes, thank goodness it's not the AAU because I'm not one of their big stars. But anyway, yes, we really do welcome you here this evening, and it's wonderful to see such a nice group and such a beautiful night. So many of you have been here before. I've seen your faces. I know that you kind of know the drill, but we have 4 guides standing over there. If you'll raise your hands, and they are all AAUW representatives. And so they are going to take your group around, and we're going to make 4 groups. So Kathy, why don't you go right over here to your left, I guess. Just come down this way, a little way.
Now back then, it was much different than it was now. That was all prairie at that time. We staked our 160 acres, which included, now would be the southeast corner of the city of Burt. Although the city of Burt was not established for another 15 years after that. But we, back then, there was no buildings. In fact, there were no trees. This was prairie for as far as you could see. There was no trees in that area.
It's funny, there's a lot of trees now. Yeah. So,
You lived in Algona?
oh yeah, well, so Algona was the closest area that had supplies and our shelter. And so we built a little shanty here in Algona. And then John and the boys, they would go up and they would work on the farm and work at building our new home.
We cleared, plowed, and planted.
And our very first home in Burt, it was a sod house. And so we took all those rugs that we brought and we put them on the floors and we put them on the walls. We even used them as room dividers. Oh, but those Iowa winters, they were so cold here, and the boys would tell stories years later about how some winter days they'd wake up with a blanket of snow on their bed.
Now, for 3 years, I worked hard to make that farm a paying proposition. It was difficult on New Prairie. Finally, in 1869, I decided to take a job helping build the railroad through Algona. And it was just 10 days later when I was working, digging out along a hillside just above the river, when a big hunk of dirt broke loose and fell down on me, crushing me badly. Although they dug me out as quickly as they could, I was very badly injured.
The attending doctor wrote in his records, "He was unconscious when I reached him. I remained with Wilson until after his death."
I was 56 years old.
The newspaper obituary said, "An old gentleman named Wilson was killed yesterday afternoon by the falling of a bank of earth in the deep cut of the railroad near the grist mill. A large body of earth caved off, crushing the old man under its weight."
Now, if you think of the river down here, just below Cinco de Mayo, where there's a bend in the river, in the fall of the year when there's less leaves, you can see a cement pier out in the middle of that river. That's a part of the mill that's being referred to, and the accident that happened was just south of that along the railroad.
After John passed, I was a widow for 46 years. And during that time, my children, they went off on their own paths. Samuel, he farmed in Nebraska and Iowa. And our son Billy, oh, he had wanderlust. First, he was a stagecoach driver, and then he was a sailor. And then Family Stories has it that he bought a hotel in San Francisco and was in the 1906 earthquake where he was injured. He passed in 1937 at a senior home. And then our son Robert J. Wilson started as a clerk in the store, and then he went on to be a dentist in Olwine, and he passed in 1926. And Thomas opened a mercantile in Buffalo Center called the Wilson Store. And for 2 more generations, it was run by Wilsons there.
Now, Edward lived with his mother and survived her by 8 years and is buried alongside her here. Eddie, I remember him on our trip out to Iowa in the covered wagons. He often played on his violin on the way to entertain us. But poor Eddie, he suffered a fall on the farm when he was 12, and it affected his development, so he stayed with his mother after that. And Margaret, Maggie, our oldest daughter, also lived with her mother. She survived her mother by 1 year and lays here beside her also.
And as my children left home, I became more involved in the Burt community. I was actually one of the founding members of the Burt Methodist Church on Beach Street in Burt, Iowa. And you will find in some of the histories pictures of me with a large group of Methodist women there. And there's also another large party picture, and it's for my 90th birthday.
In the few pictures that survive, she was always in the front and center. Now, one charming note from the Burt Monitor of 1908 read, "Grandma Wilson, while in town Monday, was a most pleasant caller at this office. She takes great interest in political matters and is so well versed in the doings of our political parties for the last 70 years that she's able to give some very valuable advice to both parties. And she's a great believer in the ability of Taft to give us the best administration this country has ever had."
And you know what, John? The next week it was picked up by the Buffalo Center Tribune. Oh, I truly admired Theodore Roosevelt, and I prayed for him daily. And I so hoped that he would become president.
Now, Anne was also a prolific poet. Now, a lot of her poetry she wrote as a tribute to friends and neighbors who had died, more as a eulogy to comfort the living. Others read more like a prayer. Now, one of her best known poems is A Daughter's Lament, where she really releases her feelings of how sad she is to have left her home country of Ireland years ago.
It was so difficult to leave them. And my whole life, I yearned to go back to Ireland and to see the beautiful hillside again. This is from one of my untitled poems. It's one of the stanzas. My dear loving parents, I'll say little more. Hard is my fate on a far distant shore. In a far distant country among strangers I roam. Ofttimes I do wish that I had never left home. In a far distant country where cool breezes blow, but you'll never know the troubles that I had to undergo.
Now, while her poetry lives on, Anne passed on in 1916 at a fine old age of 96. So looking back on history, the history that we lived through, I see so many things that we were there when the Irish potato famine started. We crossed the Atlantic with so many other new Americans and worked in the factories in Philadelphia. I, along with John, served in the Civil War, myself for its entirety. And after the war, we joined the westward movement and helped settle the westward part of the country. I died in the building of the railroads, and Grandma Wilson lived on to help establish the city of Burt. Now, our children follow in their own paths, and their descendants are left to remember their proud pioneering heritage. Thank you.
Grandma Ann Wilson was a native of Scotland and a resident of Kossuth County for decades, and she was still writing poetry in her 90s. And we are sharing 3 of her poems with you. As Ben Reed said in his History of Kossuth County, she had only a common school education, but she read widely and was well known for her poetry about family and friends and her abiding love of God. Many of her poems were written upon the death of a member of the community, and they brought comfort to the mourners. And this is one of those poems. It's called Homeward Bound. We are a happy band of pilgrims. We are marching home to heaven. We know salvation we have got. Our sins are all forgiven. It was our blessed Savior that saved our souls from death. We will shout and sing his praises as long as we have breath. And oh, how joyful it will be when this life on earth is over, to meet our blessed Savior in heaven to part no more. There he will take us by the hand, a crown put on our head. He'll say, "Come in, you are my own, for you my blood was shed. You have been true and faithful. You put your trust in me. Now in my Father's mansion forever you shall be." All our fellow pilgrims that through the earth do roam, think of the crown God has for you when he will call you home.
Welcome, folks. Thank you for coming this evening. My name is Horace Porter Skank. Please meet my daughter, Fanny Helen Skank. We would like to tell you the story of our family coming to Algona in 1856.
Before we get started with that, Father, I will tell the part that you would probably omit. The Skank family still has descendants living around Algona. Sandy Skank is one. Patricia Ward Billsborough is my granddaughter, and Jan Gardner is my great-grandson. In fact, the Skank family has 12 generations of ancestors in America. It all started with Roloff Martense Skank, who came in to New Amsterdam, later known as New York City, in 1650. The Skanks have served in many wars, and Captain John Skank was in the Revolutionary War for 7 years, and of course your service father in the Civil War. Thanks to the good Dutch record keepers, there's evidence of the Skanks back to the year 878 in the Netherlands. Christianus Skank was the start of our line, and he witnessed some documents in 1225. The Skanks of the Netherlands were wealthy and influential people, but that part of Europe had civil wars and land disputes in the 16th century. So our ancestor, Roloff Martensi, decided to come to the New World for a fresh start.
That's interesting, but in Algona in 1856, it didn't much matter what a person's ancestors had accomplished. Whether someone lived or died depended on their own fortitude, their own wits, and the grace of God above.
You are correct, Father.
Briefly then, I was born February 12th, 1822 in Fulton, New York. Fulton is in the north part of the state, very close to Lake Ontario, our easternmost Great Lakes of the Great Lakes. As soon as I could, I worked in the sawmills in the area.
My mother, Elizabeth Orvis, was a native of Burlington, Vermont. She was born in April of 1818 and lived there until her 4th year. From age 4 until early womanhood, her family lived in Toronto, Canada. On a visit to New York to see her grandparents, she met my father, and the rest, as they say, is history.
Elizabeth and I were married in June of 1844. We lived south of Fulton, New York, near Syracuse for the next few years.
That's where my oldest sisters, Mary Ann and Ardelia, were born.
In 1849, we traveled by boat on the Great Lakes to Wisconsin and Illinois. In 1851, we were south of Fond du Lac, Wisconsin, a town called Oakfield. Our third daughter, Lydia, was born there. A couple years later, we were in the Chicago and Cook County area, and in Elgin, Illinois, our son, George, was born. Up to now, we had traveled pretty much by boat. But at this time, it was April 1856, and we bought 2 teams of oxen and 2 covered wagons. And we set out for the land that everyone was talking about, Kossuth County, Iowa.
According to my sisters, Mother was not happy about this move. She had to leave behind some prized possessions, including brass candlesticks that were family heirlooms. She was also tired. After all, she was 25 when she married, and she already had 4 children, plus another, Silas Horace, on the way. She wanted to get into a more civilized place. The family had already been on the move for 7 years.
Oh, I heard my wife sighed. But we needed a place where we could put down roots and I could provide for my family. When we arrived in Algona, Judge Asa Call took us to be the type of citizens he was hoping to attract to the area. So he persuaded William Ingham to sell his claim on the Black Cat Creek, just 3 or 4 miles north of Algona. Now, Ingham and Seeley, so he sold his claim to the Reebhoffs, the Moore brothers, and to the Skank family. At that time, living in the cabin with Ingham was another man named Andrew Seeley. They were carefree bachelors, they were avid hunters and explorers. But they were also farmers, and they helped new settlers put up cabins. When we arrived on June 4th, they had already planted their second crop of corn and potatoes and melons. Ingham and Seeley and a third man, Charles Putnam, helped us put up our cabin. Now, who would imagine that that would result, from that modest cabin, would result a family farm that has been in the family 159 years, is still in the family, still owned by the family, and is still operated by the family. By July, I needed more supplies. On July 15th, Ingham and Seeley and I headed for Cedar Rapids. We made 12 miles the first day. By July 21st, we were in Vinton, Iowa. Now, Ingham and Seeley were hunting big game most of the way, but Ingham could see that I was anxious to move on. And I needed a load of flour for my family and get back to Algona. In Vinton, there was a circus. So Seeley decides to stay there. But Ingham and I moved on to Cedar Rapids. Now remember, Cedar Rapids is still 200 miles from Algona, but at that time the roads were poor, if any roads at all.
When we arrived, there were large groves of trees around the rivers and creeks, but there were no trees on our quarter section. That lack of a windbreak for our first winter was really a critical point. 1856 was absolutely the worst of all winters.
Yes, 1856 was a very memorable winter. There is one story I will never forget, and that is of the Johnson family. They settled near Tuttle Lake, clear up by the Minnesota border. They arrived late in the fall. They had provisions for a normal winter, but this was not a normal winter. It became clear that they needed to get to Algona and the settlements nearby. So they loaded all their provisions in the sleigh, and it was pulled by oxen. The Johnson family consisted of Mr. and Mrs. Johnson and 3 children, one of them being an infant. After starting, they had provisions for 5 days, and they expected to be on the road for 2 or 3 days. After starting out, it soon became apparent that the crust on the snow was too thin to support the oxen. So Johnson shoveled the snow in front of the oxen for 6 days. By this time, their supplies were nearly exhausted, and they had not covered half the distance. So Johnson set out by foot, by walking, and he first tightened down the covers on the sleigh and bid his family farewell. It was a sunny day, and the reflection on the snow blinded Johnson, and he wandered somewhat aimlessly for several hours. He did hear the barking of a dog and arrived at the James cabin. So John James and Peter Reboff and a few others organized a rescue party. Well, it took them some time to get organized. So I became concerned about the family freezing. I made my way 3 miles to the Ingham cabin, as Ingham was probably the most experienced woodsman in the area. Ingham had just returned from Fort Dodge the previous day, battling the snow all the way. At that time, there was another man living with Ingham in the cabin, William Campbell. So Ingham turned to Campbell and said, "What do you think?" And Campbell said, "If you go, I shall be with you." They set out quickly. All this is detailed and chronicled in Benjamin Reed's History of Kossuth County, pages 275 to 78. Suffice it to say, when the rescuers reached the Johnsons, they were near death. The Johnsons had frostbite, the rescuers had frostbite, but all arrived safely back in the Black Cat Creek neighborhood.
Many families offered to take them in, but they chose to stay with us until the warm weather returned. Mrs. Johnson was particularly fascinated by my mother's skill in weaving rugs from cast-off clothing on her loom, and their children enjoyed playing with my sisters.
In 1858, schooling became an issue for the children that needed to be addressed. The men of the neighborhood excavated on a hillside, out of the hillside, an opening, and lined it with logs and covered the roof with turf. They put a fireplace in one end, and the roof was a playground for the children. School started with 4 of our children, 5 of the Moore children, and 6 of the Reboffs. school was known as Gopher College. It burned after 2 years. Schooling was important to our family.
Yes, the school started with 4 of my oldest brothers and sisters. Then Myron was born in August of 1858. Alfred followed in December of 1859. I was born in May of 1862, and James was born in December of 1863. By this time, the Civil War was really at its height. At age 42, with 9 children at home, Father enlisted in the Civil War.
I had good reasons to enlist. At that time, the state of Iowa was pressuring the counties to meet a quota of enlistees, or there would be a draft. The bounty for enlisting was a $1,000 bond, payable in 10 years, plus 10% interest. At that time, my oldest child, Mary Ann, was 18, and I could rely on her to run the farm. I served until the end of the war.
Yes, Father returned to us, and then 3 years later, March 4, 1868, was the darkest spot in our family history. Our farmhouse burned to the ground, and Alfred, age 8, and James, just 4, died. It all happened so fast. Alfred was playing in the loft. A quantity of flax was being dried by the fire. A fat flash fire ensued and quickly engulfed the loft. James's little dog ran up into the loft, and James ran after it. In the boy's memory, a lilac bush was planted where the house once stood, and I understand it's still there.
It is impossible to completely recover from such a loss. We struggled on the best we could. I continued to farm until 1887. Elizabeth and I then sold our farm to our son, Myron. We continued to live in the new frame farmhouse with Myron and his wife. My wife, Elizabeth, died 2 years later.
I graduated from Eastern Iowa Normal School of Columbus Junction in 1885. I taught school for 2 years, and then I married Cyrus Ward of Kansas. We had 4 children. Our second child, Harry, is Patricia Ward Billsborough's father.
After Elizabeth's death, I tried to fill my time with various activities. I worked in some political things. I was first a Greeleyite and later a populist. The farm organization, the Grange, I was involved in that also. I did travel to visit relatives. I had just returned from visiting my son Silas in Lincoln, Nebraska. It was September 20th, 1894. A tornado struck our farm. It knocked down every building. When the house blew down, the upper plate beam landed on my chest.
I brought my father to our house for treatment of what the doctor thought was severe bruising, and he seemed to be recovering rapidly. On October 3rd, he asked to sit up, and my brothers helped him to dress. After we suggested several times that he lie down again and were refused, Cyrus went on his way to do his chores, and I went and did mine. We were happy that Father was doing well. Father, ever the great thinker and reader, was deep in a book. Lottie and Ethel, our daughters, were playing in the room when they heard him say, "Oh dear," and staggered to the bed. They called for me, and I hurried to his side. He died almost immediately. The newspaper said in his obituary that his life was less eventful than some because he stayed more closely to home. We, on the other hand, were very glad that throughout his 72 years, this was a man whose family came first. I followed his example until my death in April in 1930. God continues to bless our family these many generations. Thank you for coming to hear our story.
A daughter's lament, and it gives us some notion of the hard life of the pioneer woman. She was the first up in the morning to light the fire. I hope I'm not talking too loud. She was first up in the morning to light the fire and the last in bed at night after mending. Rocking the baby's cradle while knitting was part of her multitasking. There were few labor-saving devices or physical comforts. Her work was often undervalued, and many a husband did not see the need for his wife to have a social life. Do you wonder that pioneer women often ended up in one of the so pleasantly named lunatic asylums after a cold, windy, lonely winter in Iowa, where they were expected to stay home and run things? Anyway, here's the poem that she wrote called A Daughter's Lament. My dear loving parents, I lift my pen again to give you some information of my sorrow and pain, to tell you of the trouble I do undergo since I came to America. You would not me know. My hair has got gray, and my cheek has got pale. I wish our brave ship had never set sail to bear me to America where the cold breezes blow, for you don't know the trouble that I do undergo. The times have got hard, and my family is large. I tell you, loving parents, I have a heavy charge. But that does not vex me, of that you do know, nor that is not the trouble that I do undergo. Each day I am working, I do the best I can, still hoping my troubles will soon have an end. But instead of some pleasure, more sorrow does flow, and you don't know the trouble that I do undergo. Each returning Sabbath brings no pleasure to me. My husband, he dresses and goes his friends to see. Alone I am sitting till dark night does grow, and that's part of the trouble that I do undergo. My dear loving parents, I will say little more, but hard is my fate on a far distant shore. In a far distant country among strangers to roam, oft times I do wish that I had never left home. In a far distant country where cold breezes blow, but you'll never know the trouble that I do undergo. My goodness, she was sad that day, wasn't she?
And I'm buried over here. My wife Ida and I are here in the cemetery. I have an interesting history. I wasn't born here. I was actually born in England. Came here a number of years after coming to the United States. But this is definitely the place I call home. And so I want to tell you a little bit about it and about my time here in Algona. Here I lie buried under the prairie sod, so far from where my life began, because I was born George Capewell. I'm the only son of William and Sarah Capewell, and I was born in Little Haywood, Staffordshire, England on March 30th, 1847. I live with my parents and my four sisters, Jenny, Elizabeth, Eliza, and Sarah, and I began my education in England. But my parents died while I was quite young. And so it was that my mother's sister, Lucy Shelley, took us under wing, and she decided to move to the United States. We came with her. And once we came to the United States, I was no longer George Capewell, I was George Shelley. We first located in New York City, and soon after that we moved to Berkshire, Massachusetts. And I was there and continued to go to school until I was 13. Then I dropped out of school, and I became an apprentice as a marble cutter. It was then that I began to see that I had a real talent for marble carvings. To create carvings from stone, it takes both artistry and strength. I learned to choose my stones carefully, to look for cracks, to look for grains in the stone, to look for flaws. Carving marble, granite, and stone involved much physical effort, and it was all done by hand. I had to use a number of hammers and chisels and files. And polishing was done by water and sand. It was dusty, dirty work. But if all went well, I would have a product that would last for centuries. And you see around you here in this cemetery some of that product. I studied for 4 years as an apprentice marble cutter. But then at 17, something exciting happened that took up some time. At 17, I ran off to join the war. The Civil War had been raging for 3 years, and I joined the Navy. I went to Maine and joined the Northwest Squadron at a port there in Maine. Now, during my enlistment, I was in 19 different vessels, mostly in the river service. I'm proud to have served under General David Dixon Porter and General William Radford and Admiral David Farragut. My longest service was on the USS Gazelle, and it served between the Red River and Grand Ecore, Louisiana. I served on the Gazelle as we did a number of different things. We had skirmishes with enemy shore units. We convoyed Union troop transports. We patrolled the river. We helped Union Navy gunboats in assisting with the capture of Fort DeRussy. I also spent some time on the James River and Fort Fisher following the capture of that fort by Union forces. Although it was an exciting time, I'll have to admit that I was actually glad when the war ended, because then I was able to get back onto the shore, onto firm soil, solid ground. And so after the war, I traveled to New York City. And after my discharge, I found work again in the marble business. And for 4 years, I honed my skills even more. In 1870, I moved to Ashley Falls, Massachusetts, where I met Ida W. Parsons. This was important because Ida was to be my wife. She was destined to be my bride, and we were married the next year in Millerton, New York. We immediately moved to Salisbury, Connecticut, and then 2 years later to Stouffville, Canada. All the while we operated a marble business. We eventually returned to Ashley Falls, and we stayed there until 1886. But I had always had an intrigue about going west, and so had Ida. And so it was that we went to Wisconsin and stayed there for 3 years. And then we decided to go even farther west, and we went to Iowa. And first we went to Mason City, spent a short time there. Then we went to Emmitsburg and spent a short time there. And then finally we came to the place that God had called us, call our home. We came to Algona, Iowa in 1888. And I opened Algona Marble Works and began my trade. There had been no marble works in Algona, and so people readily supported my business. And I was so pleased with the support that I got. Algona was thriving at that time. Many war veterans had settled in the area. Population was growing quickly. Much new construction was going on. New homes and businesses were being built almost as fast as supplies could come in. And my business grew quickly, by leaps and bounds. Within 2 years of me opening the business, I had moved to 2 larger locations, and I had added a partner. Many of the monuments that you see here were original monuments from my shop. We specialized in cemetery markers in marble, granite, and stone. We also built specialty pieces such as tables and statuary and decorative items. Our reputation continued to grow. We shipped monuments all over the county, all over the state, and eventually all over the country. Many of the monuments that you see here were mine. I carved them. I took great pleasure in meeting my customers' needs. I had some customized pieces that I displayed in the shop, and they could be tweaked and fine-tuned, or I could build something entirely new, depending on the needs of the customer. Both Ida and I just dearly loved Algona. We became involved in the community and in our church, the Congregational Church. And we did a number of civic things. One was that I ran for city weighmaster, and the scales, I was elected, and the scales were installed right at my place of business. The scales were used for weighing coal and for other items. Now, one thing I was quite active in was the Veterans Organization, the Grand Army of the Republic. Ida was involved in the relief organization, the women's part of that organization. Together we held many different offices, and we volunteered for many other things. These organizations were very involved in the community at that time. We weren't that far from the Civil War. Many veterans had settled here, and we provided food and programs and other things such as medical aid for veterans and their spouses and children. And so we raised money for those different kinds of events. Now, one of the major fundraisers held annually was the Bean Supper. that was put on by the Ladies of the Relief organization. They did it at the Armory every year. The programs given on those occasions were always the highlight of the evening. Many addresses were amusing and always left the people in good humor. With Dwight Manwaring on the organ, I often led the GAR boys and the crowd in rousing sing-alongs, singing songs such as Tinning on the Old Campground and 1,000 Years. Each year on Decoration Day, the GAR would organize a day-long celebration to honor veterans who had previously passed away to their eternal reward. There were always parades and special events to honor their sacrifice. I particularly remember one such celebration. It was on the 40th anniversary, 1905, the commemoration of the 40th anniversary of the end of the war. There was a standing room only crowd in the Call Opera House. Many who sought admission were turned away. The GAR post and the WRC entered as a body. The Congregational Church was represented by the choir, which was under the direction of Professor Benjamin. And the choir was in fine form. They sang patriotic hymns, patriotic ballads. I began the program with the reading of the orders and President Lincoln's Gettysburg speech. The orator's eloquent address paid tribute to the great leaders of the Civil War, to the private soldiers and noble women who cared for the sick and wounded in the camp and in the hospital. I remember to this day Miss Ethel Laird's feelingly rendered recitation recalling a thrilling incident of the Civil War. And there was this tremendous drill team made up of many girls in white dresses that performed these wonderful movements that we would never forget. They were beautiful and varied and touching. And in the afternoon, the annual parade was held. It began at the GAR building and came all the way here to this cemetery. The procession was led by the Algona Band, with Company F Iowa National Guards acting as the guard of honor for the Grand Army and the Relief Corps. And the cemetery that day never looked any more beautiful. It was filled with people. And there were flowers covering every grave. The decoration of the graves was performed by squads of children under the direction of veterans. And the ceremony was so impressive. Such memorable events to commemorate our fallen brothers. Ida and I would never forget. But unfortunately, by 1909, Ida's health had begun to fail. Her doctor recommended healing treatments with the sulfur baths, the healing properties of the sulfur baths that were located in Oklahoma. We were advised to move to warmer climes. So I reluctantly sold the Marble Works, and we regretfully left Algona. We traveled to Sulphur, Oklahoma, where Ida could have her treatments. I went on to Corpus Christi, Texas, where we found more permanent housing. And I opened a ice cream and confectionery store. And quite frankly, that kept me quite busy. It was a busy time. But something great happened. Ida got better. she got strong enough that after 2 years, we moved back to Algona. And that was our great joy. Because we had so missed Algona. We'd missed our church, we'd missed the GAR. And the return here was so heartwarming. I mean, people just welcomed us with open arms. Our dear friend James Patterson invited us to move into his home while we searched for a permanent dwelling. And so it was that we got back into the swing of things. I once again became engaged in the monument business. I worked both for Algona Monument Works and then Northwestern Granite Works. But in 1913, I opened my own firm. But in that year, in July, I suffered a setback. A 1,300-pound monument fell on my foot. And I was confined to bed for 6 weeks. Now, I eventually got back to work, but I never was quite the same. And I had to favor that foot the rest of my life. Yes, we enjoyed our time. We enjoyed our camaraderie. But then in the early 1920s, I suffered some physical setbacks myself, including 2 strokes, which left me partially paralyzed. Ida, too, was dealing with the setbacks and infirmities of old age. She did her best to care for me. She was so faithful to our church, she never missed a Sunday. She continued to attend even when her physical limitations made it very difficult to go on. I was sure that I would pass before she did, but our Heavenly Father had other plans. Ida passed first. She quietly slipped away on December 20th, 1925, after an illness of several weeks. Her passing was a heavy blow to me. We had been married for 54 years. We'd experienced most of life's adventures together. Ida and I had always just had each other. The Lord had not blessed us with children. And so it was that I had no one to succeed me. I had 2 nieces that lived out east. And so without Ida, I had to find somebody to look after me. Fortunately, a local nurse, Mrs. Joseph Zitris, took me into her home and cared for me for the next few months until my death in September 28, 1926. My funeral services were held at the home of my good friend James Patterson. As I gaze upon this picturesque cemetery, I see hundreds of headstones that I carved. You can find examples of my work in all the cemeteries in Kossuth County, as well as many others across Iowa and the nation. I've carved angels and lambs and crosses and books of life and many other designs too numerous to mention. As you walk through here tonight, I encourage you to look around you at the monuments that you pass. A cemetery such as Riverview is really an outdoor gallery displaying works of art carved from marble and granite and stone. It is rewarding to me that my talents not only have honored the person for which each monument is dedicated, but that altogether these monuments contribute to the overall beauty of this very sacred place. As I look down, it seems quite ironic that our own stones are rather plain, while so many others are not. But perhaps it's fitting that my stones point to the other stones, the ones that I was blessed to carve, the ones that make this such a beautiful place, a lasting legacy that surrounds us all. Thank you for coming tonight to my Riverview Cemetery.
This is by Edgar Lee Masters, who wrote Spoon River Anthology, and in 1916 it was published. And the witty and honest epitaphs of the citizens of the mythical town of Spoon River, Illinois, give us another version of life in the 19th century. And this is his description of Lucinda Matlock. And it introduces us to a spunky woman, and many of her type resided in Algona as well. All right, this is about Lucinda Matlock. I went to the dances at Chandlerville and played Snap Out at Winchester. I've never heard of Snap Out. One time we changed partners, driving home in the moonlight of middle June, and then I found Davis. We were married and we lived together for 7 years, enjoying, working, raising 12 children, 8 of whom we lost ere I had reached the age of 60. I spun, I wove, I kept the house, I nursed the sick, I made the garden, and for holiday I rambled over the fields where sang the larks. And by Spoon River, gathering many a shell and many a flower and medicinal weed, shouting to the wooded hills, singing to the green valleys. At 96, I had lived enough. That is all. And I passed to a sweet repose. What is this I hear of sorrow and weariness, anger, discontent, and drooping hopes? Degenerate sons and daughters, life is too strong for you. It takes life to love life.
Well, let's see. As I look over our friends here, Miss Fetchner, I think Algona could use a milliner, don't you, my dear?
I would agree.
I see bare arms and legs, and not many hats. My, what have we come to? Well, let me introduce myself to you. I am Nancy Feely Setchell, and I owned a millinery business here in Algona until 1937. And let me tell you a little bit about myself. I was born on December the 3rd, 1859. My parents emigrated from Prussia, and when they came to the United States, they settled in Cook County, Illinois. My father was a rural decorator, if you can imagine. And what he did was he was up on the exterior and interior buildings on ladders, painting, working with his hands. And my father had an unfortunate accident and fell off of his ladder and suffered some permanent disabilities from that particular incident. And so he couldn't be a rural decorator anymore working on ladders. So he decided on a career change, which he determined that he was going to become a farmer. Not sure if that was a really good choice, but at the same time, another event was influencing his decision. My brother was 3 years old and not doing very well, and the doctors determined that his breathing troubles were as a result of tuberculosis. I'm sure you've heard about that disease. And the doctors at that time prescribed that my brother should have clean air and wide open spaces. So as a result of all of those events, my parents determined that they were going to move west to Algona. And I was almost 10 years old, around 1869. We put all of our worldly possessions in a covered wagon and moved west and lived on a farm in Cresco Township, 8 or 9 miles away from here. Well, By the time I turned 13, you understand my father's been trying to farm during this time. I was employed as a rural school teacher at the age of 13. And I took my responsibilities very seriously. I needed to contribute to the home, and I needed to work, so I went to work. And my first day of school wasn't my best. We all went to the rural school, and we were all outside ready for the first day of school, myself and my students. And the superintendent, Mr. Nick Redding, forgot to open the door, forgot to bring the key. So there we stood, waiting to have our first day of school. And luckily I had some enterprising students who knew how to shimmy in the back window, open a loose window, and get inside, and we had our first day of school. Well, believe it or not, a year and a half later, I was elected to be a teacher here in Algona. They elected teachers, how about that, back in those days. Well, about that time, farming wasn't going so well, and my little brother passed away. And so my family moved into Algona. My parents built a house on Elm Street. My sisters and I and my mother and father lived in that home. At that time, I met a fellow by the name of Leroy Setchell, who was 22 years older than I am. And he wouldn't be the first person that I would have selected to be my husband, but I have to say he was really nice. And when he asked me to marry him, I said yes. And so on Christmas Eve, December 24th, 1878, we were married. I was 19 years old, so if you add 19 and 22, my husband was 41. Yep. A year later, I had our son, Carl, who was our only child. And, we raised Carl and commenced to having, our housekeeping and had our family. And sadly, when Carl was about 7 years old, my husband passed away. So there I was, 27 years old with a young son. I couldn't teach with a young son like that. That just wasn't heard of in those days. So I had to figure out another way to make some income for my family. Now, my husband and I had saved some funds at the time. But as luck would have it, a woman in town sold her millinery stock. So I took on a partner by the name of Mrs. Black, and we pooled our funds and bought the millinery stock, and we opened our own shop, dressmaking, hat making, and millinery. So we were in business. Now, our shop was located in the McCall building, and the McCall building later turned into the Boston Block. But after a couple of different moves, my shop's permanent location was around where there is a pet store in downtown Algona now. I'm sure you know the place, downtown Algona. Well, my son and I lived in that location. We lived in the rooms out in the back, and my shop was out front. Now, my shop was a pretty busy shop. As you know, us ladies, we like to get dressed up for special occasions. You go to church, what's the first thing you do? Try to see what everybody else is wearing. So people came and they got their dresses made, and I made hats for them, special order. And back in those days, hats were pretty much larger than what you would imagine. You've seen a few of them around. My hats had a base of, we called it a skeleton, but it had a metal frame, and we would wrap it in buckram or linen all the way around it for the underlayer, and then we would put silk on the inside so as to not muss our ladies' hair. And on the outside, the very nice fabric that we sold would be put there, whatever the customer wanted. And then we had all these beautiful embellishments to put on the hats. We had leather and jewels and fringe and veil, and I even made these beautiful fabric flowers for my ladies. And everybody loved their hats for special occasions. Some had more hats than others, depending on how well off they were. And my ladies, I had a couple of ladies sewing for me on occasion on the long 12 to 14 hour days. I had a Miss Cora Setchell and a Miss Agnes Seeley who sewed for me before she became Mrs. Seeley. So we were very busy. So I also invested in some rental properties. Went in a partnership, bought some properties, and got some income off of the rents of those properties. So I had to be enterprising in those days to raise my son. Now my son Carl, he attended Algona High School and graduated at the age of 17 and went off to the University of Minnesota. Very proud of my son. But about that time, the Spanish-American War broke out. And like his father, my son Carl, he enlisted and went off to the Philippines and was involved in, many skirmishes and battles over there. When the war was over, he was honorably discharged. He came back to Algona, got a job. His first job was as a traveling salesman. But when he came back, he had a standing ovation at our beautiful Call Opera House. And also there was a ball given in his honor at the 52nd Iowa Infantry location. So he received many honors for his military service. Now Carl went on and got married to a Miss Pearl Peck in 1906, and they had 2 children, Kermit and Richard. Kermit is buried right here. And sadly, Carl didn't have very good fortune toward the end of his life. His marriage failed, and he held several jobs. His last job was he worked in St. Paul as the chief of delivery services. But after a few years, his health failed, and one of my very great sadnesses is that my son died before he reached the age of 50. And we buried Carl. He had an intestinal illness that just, he fought for a good week, but he couldn't beat it, and they said he fought like a soldier. So we buried Carl. That was around 1929. Now from 1929 to 1937, those were some rough years, and not just for me. The economy was bad, and for some reason, no one thought a hat was really a necessity. People were spending their money on necessities, and hats didn't quite make it as a necessity. But we stayed open, and another challenge for me was this lovely lady next to me opened her millinery store, and she was my stiff competition and younger than me about that time. And I was getting on in years. Well, in 1937, I broke my hip, and our medical care back then, basically you pretty much went to bed, and I was bedfast from 1937 until I died in 1949. My grandson Kermit and his family took me in, took care of me as long as they could, but when I required more care, I went to the Humboldt Rest Home and died after a very short illness in 1949. Thank you so much for listening to my story.
My name is Ann Fetchner, and Nanny's right. I did prove to be very stiff competition for her after I learned a lot. I started out in the Elite Hat Shop that was owned by Mrs. James Taylor when I was all of 19 years old in 1911. And I was so excited. It was my first job. What young woman wouldn't love to work around all those beautiful hats? I didn't find out until later that the other ladies at the shop gave me about a year. I had the last laugh, though, because I was there 50 years later. Every spring and fall, the hat trimmers would come from Chicago, and I watched them very carefully to see what it was they did to create hats that women would love. Well, in 1920, Mrs. Taylor passed away, and she willed her shop to me. It's kind of a scary thing to have happen, but exciting and challenging at the same time. And I was thrilled that I brought in $3,500 in merchandise sales in my first 6 weeks. $3,500. Come on, that's a lot of money back then. I really enjoyed the hat shop. I loved doing the trimming, so I never hired a hat trimmer. I did it myself. And as Nanny said, the hats were made of buckram. Women would come in and try them on and make sure that the structure was right. I'd put on the exterior fabric. Then they'd come in and choose the trimmings that they wanted. I'd put that on, and they'd come in and get their finished product. Some of the ladies, though, would not buy the hat until they'd taken a trial run around the block in their buggies. They wanted to make sure that the feathers were not too high for the tops of the buggies. After pheasant hunting became legalized in Iowa, a woman came in one time with a pheasant, the whole bird. She wanted a hat made out of it. Well, I sent that rooster right on to Chicago, and for $25, that woman ended up with a beautiful hat, wings and all. Now, color was always very important to me, as it is to all milliners, and I really worked hard, especially with my older ladies, to convince them that maybe a softer color might be more flattering to their complexion than a navy blue or a black hat. And I really struggled with all of my ladies, trying to convince them that they might find it more flattering to wear beige hose instead of black. They thought it was too daring, though. It was a struggle to get that across to them. All in all, though, I had a wonderful time. I would go to Chicago twice a year, every year. It was my favorite part of the hat business because while I was in Chicago, I stayed in a lovely hotel. I went to lots of concerts, shows, and plays, had a fabulous time. And one time, one of the highlights of my trips to Chicago was when I got to meet Jimmy Dorsey and got an autographed picture. Wasn't he a handsome devil? Look at him. It was as much fun to watch him and look at him as it was to listen to him. I never married, so it was just fine for me to look and enjoy. I have wonderful memories of the hats that I would make. Part of my job as a milliner was to help the ladies decide what style of hat would suit their facial features and what they were looking for. Some of the most popular styles were the Watteau Sailor, the helmet, can you imagine that, helmet hat, the cartwheel, and my favorite was the Empress Eugenie with this elegant curved feather. One time a lady came in and she wanted a regret for her hat, and I thought, a regret? Did I do something wrong? Then I realized, oh, no. She wanted an egret feather on her hat. And you know, sometimes I had to be a referee because my hats were so popular that women would come to blows wanting the same hat. I had to be a master of diplomacy at times like that. Well, in later years, the hats were becoming ready-made, but they still would bring them in, and I would trim them to match those very special suits that they would buy in Minneapolis or Des Moines. And I took pride in the fact that our Algona ladies were just as fashionably dressed, especially with their hats, as the ladies in any of the large cities around here. And even though we were miles away from any of those big cities like Minneapolis or Chicago, the ladies here still took great pride in their appearance and wanted to look very nice. So in later years, I brought in a line of fur coats that were very well received, very popular. I also sold some sewing machines, the Domestic and the New Home brands of sewing machines. And later on, those machines became part of the business of the North Iowa Sewing Machine Company. I loved my job, always had. And I figured there was no need for me to quit. I had a wonderful retirement plan set up, But I didn't want to leave the hat shop. I was having too much fun. I figured I'd just drop over dead in the store sometime. I didn't expect hats to completely go out of style. And it was very hard for me to have to sell my building and watch it be demolished for another business. But I always kept this scrapbook, and in it I kept cartoons and programs and pictures and quotes that meant a lot to me. And one of my favorites was this: character is a matter of your mental attitude and how you spend your time. I chose to spend my time being happy. And after living a very full and happy life, I passed away in March of 1969. Thank you for coming to visit us.